A small Chicago church gets a windfall of over $1.5 million. How they chose to spend that money is going to surprise, and it's going to inspire you. That's next on Significant Insights. Hello and welcome to the program. Good to have you with us today. How would you spend a financial windfall? Well, our program today is about exactly that. LaSalle Street Church in Chicago is a small congregation of about 300. But LaSalle is a church where, as they say, the gospel has skin on it. In fact, LaSalle started the first faith-based legal aid clinic in the country. In 2014, LaSalle, facing a number of financial pressures, received a windfall in the form of $1.5 million. Now, this came from the sale of property the church had made a $1,000 investment in back in 1970. However, instead of focusing inward on their own financial needs, LaSalle looked outward. They decided to tithe the money by giving 10% back to their congregation, with the instructions to use the money to do good in the world. And they were equally generous with how they spent the remaining $1.4 million. Senior pastor Laura Traux and Ami Campbell wrote the book Love Let Go, Radical Generosity for the Real World, about the church's experiences with that financial gift. And they joined me today. Hey, thank you for being on the program today. You've got quite a fascinating story that people need to hear about. Tell us about LaSalle Street Church and how you ended up with an incredible windfall that I think was about double your annual budget.
That's right. Back in 1970, the church, when it was very small, a congregation of maybe 50 people, with Bill Leslie as the pastor, who was making, his salary was about $3,000. At the time, there was property across the street from the church, and the alderman had come to Bill Leslie and said, I've been offered a bribe to help get the land rights for this property to a commercial enterprise. If you don't want that to happen, then you gotta organize something here. And there were people who were being served by LaSalle at the time. These were folks who were on the fringe economically, living in row houses, public housing, and they were the ones being ministered to by this group of 50 people. So Bill rounded up some other pastors. He got each of these pastors to contribute $1,000 each for these churches. So in total, the churches had contributed $5,000. With that $5,000, they were able to create an organization that worked with both the city as well as a private investor to secure those land rights. That was in 1970. By 1980, the doors finally open to Atrium Village, which becomes the first public-private church partnership of a mixed-race, mixed-income housing development. So some of those people who were in those row houses could stay put, and that was really the purpose of that investment. So fast forward then to 2014, when the covenants are coming off of that agreement, that initial contract, and the developer is ready to sell, and the churches each at that point have a 1.5% share. And Laura gets an email one day, and you could take it from there.
I get an email that the property had been sold. The property had been sold, and each church stood to get 1.6 and change. At LaSalle Street Church.
What was your budget at the time? About
$800,000.
Yeah, about 800.
Yes.
800 and change, like 805 or something. Yeah, so I remember.
Did you dance through the hallway? I mean, what?
I really just sat there, and then I yelled out to the staff, and I said, "You got to come in and see this." So they all kind of gathered round, and we thought, "Wow, what's next?"
Well, you had at that time a mortgage.
Yeah, on our ministry building.
1.3.
That's
so
right.
Immediately, I would be thinking, you know what? You're going to be debt-free.
Yeah.
This is going to be incredible.
Yeah, we had a couple of pressers. We had the 1.3 mortgage, and we were in the process of losing access to our Sunday morning parking. So we felt very pressured to potentially invest in a parking lot. So those were kind of the two things out
There's
on the
a lot
table.
of ways you can use
There-
1.6
That's
million.
right, especially when you're small like us.
You didn't do any of that.
No, we didn't.
Tell
We
me about
didn't.
the process, because I'm sure you had on your board and other people were giving you all kinds of advice, good stewardship. What, here's what you ought to be doing.
Right. Well, for a few weeks, we just all collectively prayed about it. And then at some point in that prayer process, the thought came that we should at least start by tithing the money.
Yeah.
And that we should tithe the money by giving that all to the 300-ish, roughly, people that we have on Sunday morning that were part of our church community at that point. So 10%, 160,000. That meant about $500 for each person. And first we had to all get on board with that idea, that tithing idea. And we, as we say in the book, that was not an easy street. We all had a lot of concerns about that. One person said, give a tithe. We are the tithe. The church is the tithe. So we had some conversations around
How
that.
serious were some of the differences in those discussions?
It took a few months of conversations before we got to the point where we felt free to give away the tithe.
But ultimately, you reached a consensus
We did.
where everybody said, okay, we feel okay. Well, that's rare in itself.
Yes.
It wasn't unanimous, but it was a consensus. And it was a respectful consensus, importantly.
Yeah.
So 5 days later, Sunday morning, at church, we announced that Atrium Village had sold, and that our first step was to tithe on the money. This is now in September of 2014, and that everyone in our church family was getting a $500 check.
You use that as an opportunity also to teach generosity.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Absolutely. It's because what is that? When money falls from the sky like that, which essentially is what happens, right? We recognize that as a gift. We say, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
look what just came to me.
Yeah.
And I have this privilege of being able to give it away. What this taught us is that every dollar we had was also a privilege,
Yeah.
right? You didn't see, if you saw that $500, you saw the $500 that may have been sitting in your checking account the same way. So you got to see that actually everything is a gift. And just remembering that is pivotal, right? It's so easy for us to get caught in the narrative that I work hard, I've earned every penny, I have studied, I have made all these sacrifices, and that's why I have what I have. We forget that actually everything that we have is a gift.
So how about you? Do you look at your resources in the same way, recognizing that all you have is a gift from God? When we come back, our guests will share stories of how members of their congregation spent their portion of the tithe to do good in the world. We'll be right back.
The first thing he did, he rounded up his friends from the viaduct. And he took them, and we have this on film saying, I took them to a real restaurant meal and a show. They went to the movies and they went to dinner, and he said, for that night, we were just regular guys.
Welcome back. In 2014, LaSalle Street Church in Chicago received a windfall check for over $1.5 million. So the church decided to tithe 10% back to the congregation in the form of $500 checks to everyone, with a simple instruction to simply do good in the world. Senior Pastor Laura Traux and Ami Campbell are talking about the biblical principle of generosity and the effect that their Love Let Go campaign had on the congregation and also on the community. You start your book saying that generosity is, you describe it, as a matter of fact, as a superpower. Tell me how you perceive that.
We know from social science that it is a superpower, right? There's actual evidence, there's data that it is a powerful, it's as powerful as one expert says as a drug like insulin. He says it's that powerful. It has the power to make us feel better about ourselves. It actually has health benefits to us. So it is a superpower from a very data-driven science perspective, but it's also a superpower from a spiritual perspective. It is a power that enables us to see something bigger than what's right in front of us, right? It's a power that enables us to see a little bit of a glimpse of what God is seeing in the world, that we can see a world of abundance when it's so easy to focus on scarcity. So generosity reframes that picture for us. And so it helps us both very practically, but we also feel it frees us. It frees us in a real
So you're saying
sense.
that more than what happens to the recipients, that it's a health benefit, an emotional health benefit, a spiritual benefit to the person then who is generous.
I think it transforms us more than it transforms the people who receive it. And I think we witnessed that over and over in our church. And I would say our body feels that way too. Our entire church body feels the same way, that what people were looking forward to when our congregants all received their $500 checks, what people were really looking forward to was how it would transform us and how it would change our church and the way we interacted with each other. Absolutely.
You know, if I can just mention, Paul, in that great fundraising passage in 2 Corinthians, he talks with the Corinthian church saying, your surplus is for their need, and their need is for your surplus.
Yeah.
I mean, he explicitly ties our economic fortunes together and says, it's exactly, this is the reason you've been blessed, and this is the reason you have this need, is so that you would come together in this kind of wonderful playing field. This is God's economy.
And in another place, he says, you know, I don't have to have your money, but for your own sake.
Right, for your
It's
own
important.
sake, you should be giving to the church in Jerusalem. Exactly.
But for your own sake, it's important that you're doing this.
That's right.
So when you gave the money, people then have to make a choice what they're going to do with it.
Right.
That's what you actually challenge them to.
Yeah.
Right. We wanted people to be discerning about it. Yes, of course, some people knew instantly what they wanted to do with the money, because they had actually, you know, there are people who do give all the time, and so are always discerning. But others, this really was the first real chance they had to exercise this discernment about giving. Right. And so the day we got our $500 checks, we also got a book called The Way of Discernment. And so each of us worked through that book, and we also had an opportunity to sign up for small groups so that we could discern together. And we could discern both what we should individually do with our $500, but we also still had $1.44 million as a church, and we had to discern what we were going to do with that.
Right.
And as we know very well, LaSalle has always been a collaborative church. It's never been a top-down church, and so we knew that process needed to be collaborative, and so we wanted the entire church's voice in that $1.44 million decision as well. And so we individually had to discern what to do with our $500, and we collectively had to discern.
Let's start with the individuals. So what happened? Do you have stories that came out of that some pretty remarkable
many.
stories?
Yeah, we had a wall covered in stories.
Really?
Literally, people were using that paint, you know, that you can just paint on the wall with, and we had a powerful story. A homeless guy by the name of Steve, recently deceased, who
was a member of your church.
A member of our church, who had moved from the Viaduct in Lincoln Park, where he had lived for a number of years, into the YMCA right there on Chicago Ave. And the first thing he did, he rounded up his friends from the Viaduct. And he took them, and we have this on film, saying, I took them to a real restaurant meal and a show.
Wow.
They went to the movies and they went to dinner, and he said, for that night, we were just regular guys.
Wow.
So that was Steve's story.
That's emotional.
It's
That's really
it
moving.
chokes me up every time I tell
Yeah.
that story.
It's relative blessing, right? You start to see it from a framework of,
Yeah.
I'm blessed. I'm blessed in
Yeah.
this way, and this way, and this way,
Yeah.
relative to this person who might not have the blessing.
Right.
You know, Steve is seeing his old friends who don't have the blessing of
Yeah.
being able to go to a show.
Now, in the book, you also talk about some people who said, you know, I don't have enough to achieve my vision on my own, but let's put some people together.
Right. Again, collaboration. We had some very savvy givers. A guy who worked for Marriott had, he and his wife pooled their money. He had it matched by several of his friends. They got it matched by a grant from Marriott, and he started a food program on the west side under Breakthrough Ministries that is still going on. It was a fresh market. It tells you that generosity starts right where you're at. You know, one woman paid for the funeral of her next door neighbor whose son tragically was lost to the violence of Chicago streets. So an immediate need, right? But there were other people who don't live next door to that kind of uncertainty. So they, in a sophisticated way, did all these clever things to get a real pool of money that, that allowed them to give to things they were really passionate about, whether it was a food desert on the west side or a scholarship program for a Chicago public high school student who was going on into engineering school.
Wow.
It was rich and diverse and wonderful.
So this became internationally known
Yeah.
through the media. Did you expect that to happen?
We're a little church. You know, we're
Yeah.
300
On
on
a
a
good
good
day.
day. You know, we don't make news. And so, but I think what we realized very quickly was that this was such an upside down story from a cultural perspective. You know, a church giving away money.
Yeah.
Like what church does that?
The generosity part of all of this is something we really want. We all don't want to be selfish,
Right.
but we tend
Right,
to be.
you've hit on it, right? We are wired to give. We are built that way. We were created to give.
Yeah.
God had everything and gave it all to us.
Yeah.
And still God had enough, right?
Yeah.
We were created to give.
Yeah.
And so when the truth of that hits, right, when you see that in a story like ours, you recognize that and you
Yeah.
say, oh, that's right.
That's right.
I am created to give. This is true. This is true about me. It's true about my neighbor. It's true about our world. And so can we reclaim that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because they did it, I can reclaim
Yeah.
that too. I can do that too.
I think the reason, and also in part this story captivated the world so much, is that I think it's the gospel. It's people giving freely in the same way that God gives so freely. And I had a moment where Jesus tells all these stories of this kingdom that seems so preposterous, so bizarre. And people at the time thought it was so bizarre. A father who forgives a son before he even asks for forgiveness. A community that celebrates because a shepherd went after his one lost sheep, you know. And I think what this story tells is that, and people's captivation with it, is that they're hungry for the gospel. The world is hungry.
Because it went against the natural inclination.
It did.
You know,
It did. And
you're
it showed a
right.
different kingdom, a different way of living, and people so need to hear it.
You know, Laura's right. People will always be drawn to the gospel when they see it lived out authentically. More stories of how members of LaSalle Street Church used their $500 and how the church spent the remaining $1.4 million are found in Laura and Ami's book, Love, Let Go. It's available online wherever books are sold. More on the principle of generosity right after this.
Write down all the gifts you have at your disposal. Absolutely take account of your money, but don't stop there because God surely has given you more than just money. List your skills, your passions, your relationships, your unique personality traits. And when you're done, read the list. Then read it again. And thank God for all the blessings that you have been granted.
Well, today we saw an example of radical generosity lived out through the actions of LaSalle Street Church and its congregation. Ami Campbell wraps up our topic with how you too can apply the principle of generosity in your own life in today's final thoughts.
When people are asked, how much more money do you need to feel comfortable? Most respond, 10% more. If only I had 10% more, I could save for retirement or for my kids' college. I wouldn't have to worry about a health emergency or a car repair. I could even give more money away. Yet for every person who wants 10% more, there is someone who already has that 10%, who in turn wants 10% more. How can that be? Social scientists have a name for this phenomenon. It's called hedonic adaptation. Whether or not we call it by its fancy name, we all recognize the pattern. When our standard of living improves, we quickly become accustomed to it. And almost as quickly, we start to become dissatisfied. Take television, for example. For decades, we were content with network TV and a handful of stations. Then cable came along and we had dozens more to choose from. Soon after, we had pay-per-view, which has now evolved into being able to stream almost anything ever made into our devices anytime we wish. Remember the delight you felt the first time your family brought home a TV? Compare that to how you would feel today if presented with a black and white television with a screen not much bigger than a bread box, broadcasting 3 or 4 stations. Oh yes, we understand hedonic adaptation. It's an endless cycle of wanting more. How do we stop the cycle? Simply with generosity. Generosity starts where you are and with what you have, no matter how much or how little. Let me suggest 2 steps for renewing or increasing your giving, regardless of your circumstances. First, take an inventory. Write down all the gifts you have at your disposal. Absolutely take account of your money, but don't stop there because God surely has given you more than just money. List your skills, your passions, your relationships, your unique personality traits. And when you're done, read the list. Then read it again. And thank God for all the blessings that you have been granted, because gratitude is the birthplace of generosity. Second, identify a giving goal that you can accomplish in the next 6 weeks. Perhaps you're a terrific baker. Host a weekly bake sale and donate the proceeds. Maybe you have hundreds of social media connections. Start an online campaign for a cause you care about. Or maybe you've always wanted to tithe and right now you give 4% of your income. Aim for 4.5% over the next 6 weeks. At my church, I've watched people make small changes that stick. Gail, a retired school teacher, would treat herself to dinner out once or twice a month. After she took her inventory, she realized that she was ordering a glass of wine with each meal. She didn't need to have wine, and so she said, why don't I take the money I would have spent on the wine and put it in a glass jar at home instead? By year end, she had over $100 to give to a local ministry. These changes aren't heroic, and they don't need to be, because as the Bible tells us, giving begets giving. When we experience the joy and freedom of giving, instead of wanting 10% more, we want more of that feeling of joy and freedom. For everything we give away, we make more room for God to take up space in our lives. That's the reward of generosity. So begin today, right where you are, with what you have.
Thank you, Ami. That was, I love that idea of just being a blessing. You don't have to be heroic, just be a blessing. You know, my wife and I are givers. We have been with tithes and plus since we got married. But my wife Shirley has a thing about what she calls alms. What are we doing this month just to bless somebody? Not an organization, not just somebody that we know that needs some financial help or help in some way. What are we doing to be a blessing to people around us? And I think if we begin to think like that, we begin to understand the importance of that research that says that it really is more fulfilling to give than it is to receive. God blesses us when we have a heart of generosity. Hope you enjoyed the program today. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.